Any questions? Yes?
I cited the session yesterday where there was a test stand, and this question came up about pop-up dialogues, and there's some issue about that,
Like modality?
I don't actually know that there was a resolution, but some of the R&D people were on this, it was going back and forth at such a speed I couldn't follow. Anyway,
So without understanding what the issue might be, I'm not sure how to answer.
yeah, I think. So,
If it's a question of the dialogue not popping up in front of testing.
Well, I can answer this specific question. So
Yeah.
if you have a bunch of VIs written and implemented in test stand, and you have pop-up dialogues, you have issues with that.
So there's a way to get around that using the test and modal dialogue. So any VIs that I use that have pop-up dialogues,
You use that.
I use that. If it's a debugging thing, I might just put a really simple one-button dialogue in LabVIEW. And if it doesn't pop up right in front of everything, it's a debugging thing. It's not going to end up in the end product anyway. Anyone else? Yep.
You mentioned using PPLs. Do you guys package all of your drivers together in a PPL?
So the question is about pack project libraries and how we compile VIs together. Typically, I try to keep it to functionalities. So if I have, for instance, say we have a DAC, a DMM, a switch matrix, and communications to the UUT, I may make each of those a different pack project library. And so oftentimes I'll have base pack project libraries for kind of system level things that every test sequence might use. And then for each of my individual products, I'll probably have its own pack project library as well for its specific type functions. Anyone else?
You mentioned installers.
Yep.
In one part, do you guys have a rule of thumb as far as when you go to the trouble of creating an installer versus not? So
if it's a one-off, it's kind of borderline. I still like to create the installer, especially, so we're an integrator. Oftentimes I give a product to a customer and I may not hear back from them for another year. Or if the computer goes down, there may be issues. So when we're going to a deployment system, I would say 90% of the time I create an installer. And if only because it keeps my project organized. And if I ever have to rebuild it again, it's very easy to do that. I can do it from my laptop, I can rebuild it and put it on the machine. So, almost always. Yep.
How do you manage upgrading to new releases of LabVIEW? Do you schedule that in, or do you broken wires?
So,
where you have to do something?
Going to a new version of LabVIEW, depending on the complexity of it, or what the features you're trying to get are, could be painful, or it may not be too bad. I recently did one where we went from 2012 to 2013. It wasn't too big of an upgrade. Test stand wise, going from anything before 2012 to 2012 is a little bit bigger. There's a whole migration utility you need to do because and I changed the way the process model works for the better. But when you're going from older to newer, there's quite a bit of work that you might need to do. Had another question around here somewhere. Yep.
How do you guys handle like drivers installed by NI in your deployments?
So typically, there's kind of two ways to do it. I'll tell you. So you can include that into your main installer. Typically, what I'll do is I'll create a document that says these are the required functions. Actually, what I like to do is for a system, especially if there's more than one being deployed, I'll create a document that describes every step of the installation, from starting with the bare version of Windows to installing any LabVIEW drivers, third-party drivers, and then all the way down to the installer
So you keep them separate from your source code?
Generally, yes. I like to keep track of at least the version numbers, because you can always go onto the NI website and get those version numbers. Yep.
Why don't you make your own test and install that as always?
You can do that. Oftentimes, though, you go from a 40 megabyte installer to a 10 gigabyte installer, and sometimes deployment of that is more difficult than just having prerequisites. But it is possible, definitely.
Now, is that because you're using this hardware abstraction layer where they wouldn't pull into like the pack project library?
It's more the underlying DAC-MX drivers for connecting to instruments, or NIDMM drivers, or those kinds of things that really explode the size of your installer. The hardware abstraction layer itself is probably 5 or 10 megabytes. So it's more when you try to pull in the runtime engines and that kind of stuff where your installer gets really big. If you want to do something like that, sometimes what we'll do is we'll have a base installer that has all those drivers and stuff like that you need to install once, and then your incremental installers for each of your different test programs, just to keep them separately. Because if you need to make an upgrade to your test program, you don't necessarily want to try to reinstall DACMX and runtime engines and stuff like that. Yep.
I was just going to comment, my normal process, mostly for LabVIEW, but also when I do LabVIEW test stand, is I always do 2 installers. I have a drivers installer that will handle my LabVIEW runtime, DAC, serial, whatever I need, which usually ends up being anywhere from 500 megs to 2 gigs.
Yep.
And then I have a separate installer just for the application that frequently is only a 10 megabyte installer. And so, because even if I'm doing updates to my program, I only need that little multi-megabyte installer updated. I don't need gigabytes of drivers updated.
Which can take an hour or so to install it.
Or more.
Yeah. Anyone else? Yes.
If you're designing a turnkey type of test program that you deploy to remote locations, why would you want to upgrade your version of LabVIEW or your version of test stand? Wouldn't you want to just freeze it at a certain point?
Typically, that's what I see is people tend to freeze it until maybe they'll be working in 2012 and they kind of freeze that for a few years until there's some feature that they really want to pull in, and then maybe slowly migrate new things over to that to the new versions. Oftentimes in a manufacturing environment, people don't even like to have the internet plugged in, so you don't have to worry too much about updates because as soon as something goes wrong, that could be a catastrophic failure. You could have a lot of downtime. Yep.
One of the problems, we've been using LabVIEW and PXI-based chassis for 14-year period. So we've gone through several iterations of LabVIEW and also NI hardware. And eventually you do have to upgrade, just like with whether you're using Linux, Red Hat, or CentOS, or Windows operating system. And you're going to find that some regression testing is not done. And so there's going to be a struggle also when you go from like the old 1010 PXI chassis to a 1050. There's certain hardware and firmware that don't play with each other. We recently just acquired a division of Motorola, and they were using a test stand program that was like 7 years old.
And so that's the older version.
And they wanted us to use it, and I'm like, when we found that was done, I'm like, why would we possibly even want to migrate to something that we can't get by license and get support?
So that's kind of the thing you need to do, kind of the cost benefit of whether or not it makes sense to invest that time.
I think it's gotten better with the new release. They fixed a lot of this stuff over the
Yeah,
years.
and backwards compatibility.
So I'm talking about a long history of painful upgrades, but it's gotten a lot better.
We've got about 5 minutes to wrap up, so if you have any questions for anyone across the board, feel free to offer those now. One thing I would also like to highlight while we're waiting, please visit everyone at their booths. Most of us love to talk about these types of questions and applications all day. In fact, we probably will talk too much. So here are the booths, just in case you need to come find us afterwards. Any other questions?
Can I ask each of the 3 speakers to answer, when you're not involved in the project from inception, what's the major palm to the forehead moment where you say, oh, that's where things almost always go wrong? You have an example? I mean, everybody gave some great advice, but is there one thing in each of your experience that people regularly screw up with automated testing?
I'll say not taking the time to understand really what the requirements of the test are before you start the design.
I'll second that.
Jumping into design too quickly, and then you're 3/4 of the way design and realize, we need to go back and have these 3 features, and it's typically a pretty short.
Yeah, from my perspective, it's definitely strain relieving and misapplication of the product, trying to make it do something that it's not designed to do. And the third thing is miscalculating the future, which is very, very difficult to do. And we try to put those stops in there, but just like software, sometimes you just got to bite the bullet and upgrade.
And I'll second what Jay said. I mean, if I look back at the projects we've worked on that have been successful versus the ones that have been less successful, The ones where we put together concrete requirements at the beginning, almost always more successful. So basically error propagation from the bottom up. You just have to code a means in for that to be propagated all the way through the system. I mean, just the same way you would get a measurement up through, you can propagate your errors up through.
And we'd be happy to talk to you after.
Yeah.
You can come up, you can talk to Grant.